Hello and welcome to today's Medicinal Monday episode. I'm Dr. Susanna Alter.
And it's Dr. Ben here.
And we're both naturopathic doctors who support individuals in reversing disease and reclaiming optimal health through whole food plant-based nutrition and mind-body medicine.
And today on Medicinal Monday, we are covering the topic of nightshades, questions and comments and concerns we hear quite a lot of, quite frankly, about whether or not nightshades are healthy, whether or not some people might want to avoid or limit, or really just what we think about these plants. And we're going to be talking all about the science supporting our stance and understanding how nightshades are in fact healthy. That's kind of long story short. Yes, they are healthy for everyone. But, that being said, there are some individual things that are important to kind of unpack and understand.
Definitely. Yes. And before we do, just a few announcements, some exciting announcements that
Very exciting.
We have set up a new platform to connect with our plant-based and stress-free community, essentially.
Yeah.
We're going to be shifting from Facebook over to another platform called Locals, and the shift is going to be gradual. So don't worry.
We're not pulling the rug out from under you.
Rug out, but we love the vibe and feel over at Locals. It's a more tight-knit community. We're able to more directly communicate with you and not get kind of lost in the fluff of all the other Facebook stuff.
And let's face it, there's algorithms, there's censorship, there's all sorts of stuff that just doesn't feel good, for us at least on Facebook. So we're making the change in ways that are more aligned with us. Hopefully you're feeling it as well. So head on over to alterhealth.locals.com.
And also, our Telegram group is another way that we can directly communicate with those who are following along in the Alter Health journey.
And that is t.me/alterhealth.
Mm-hmm.
So today, now let's dive into this whole nightshade topic, shall we?
Let's do it.
And I think it's first helpful to understand. We've got our props here, by the way. We've got our nightshade.
Don't get too close to me with that stuff.
These are examples of nightshades.
Those toxic foods.
Some common examples of nightshades include potatoes and peppers and tomatoes and eggplants. Also, a lot of people who are really afraid or sensitive, however you want to put it, to nightshades. Also, steer away from cayenne pepper and paprika and really any pepper, habanero, tomatillos, and there's serranos, chilies, jalapenos. There's tons of peppers that are within this nightshade family, which is the Solanaceae family for us botany folks. I'm not a botany folk, but that's the family, the Solanaceae family. And these foods, these plants ultimately get a bad reputation, from my understanding, due to one toxic, poisonous, or maybe there's some other toxic, poisonous, but mainly one toxic, poisonous nightshade. And that is sometimes referred to as toxic nightshade, which medicinally is known as belladonna, which I say medicinally because it actually is a botanical medicine. And we're going to wrap up our conversation today talking about actually the health benefits from nightshades in the right dose, right? Because I think it's important to understand that anything can kind of be toxic. Anything can kind of be poisonous. So we can't overdose on stuff. You can drown yourself by drinking way too much water, which obviously doesn't really happen all that much. But anyway, too much of a good thing is a good thing. But what these foods have are glycoalkaloids, which, if we were to just define that, that's a type of a phytonutrient, a plant-derived nutrient, a plant-derived compound that has biochemical effects. And different glycoalkaloids have different biochemical effects. And the one that is highest in the toxic nightshades like belladonna is solanine. And yes, solanine is toxic, and we need to be very careful about that kind of thing. But when we're talking about these things, when we're talking about the foods, the potatoes, the peppers, the tomatoes, the eggplants, these kind of things, they don't have solanine. They have other glycoalkaloids that actually have beneficial health effects. So that's kind of like maybe just talking about the overview of these nightshade plants, what they are, why they've got kind of a bad reputation. And yeah, anything to add, Dr. Susanna?
Well, just to be clear, because we brought up a very toxic plant, which is belladonna, and yes, it is a medicine in a very low dose form, but just to be clear, really what you're saying is that foods like tomatoes and peppers and potatoes, white potatoes, these nightshades differ greatly from that toxic belladonna because they don't contain solanine, which is really the most toxic glycoalkaloid.
Yeah, with a caveat. Allegedly, potato leaves and green potatoes do have some solanine, and that's why that can be toxic. And maybe you've been told to not eat sprouted potatoes or cut out the sprouts, because then you might get a higher dose of this solanine, this quote unquote more toxic glycoalkaloid. But I think I don't know if there's been any real reports of people dying from eating green potatoes, but it's kind of in the same class of, and sometimes these foods also get wrapped up in the lectin conversation, right? Yeah. Because, if we don't, for example, if we don't cook our beans long enough, then we might want to be cautious of the lectin content in our legumes. But assuming that you're kind of just being mindful of how you're consuming your food, cooking it thoroughly and whatnot, not an issue to worry about for most of us. Now that being said, let's step back and talk about why are people kind of told to be potentially mindful of these nightshade vegetables. They sometimes get talked about in the conversation of systemic inflammation throughout the body and arthritic joint pain, and these kind of inflammatory conditions that stem from the gastrointestinal system. And there's this kind of theory that eating the lectins, eating the glycoalkaloids, eating the nightshade sort of vegetables can promote further gastrointestinal inflammation, digestive upset, leading to that kind of systemic inflammatory phenomenon. But we've already covered this in previous Medicinal Mondays, and we're going to do a recap of really how to avoid, reverse for good these sort of food intolerances. Because some people might have an inflammatory response from eating potatoes or broccoli or cauliflower or spinach or kale or any plant. But as we often bring up, that sort of symptom, that sort of like acute kind of response that we might have from eating a food does not mean that we need to run the other way from that food forever. We might benefit from giving that food a break for a few days, a week, a couple weeks, whatever it is. But in the end, our goal ought to be increased biodiversity of the gut, which, in other words, creates a more robust, resilient, harmonious microbiome that creates that resilience against potential inflammatory insults that could be from these kind of quote unquote maybe more like phytonutrients that have these bad reputations.
Right. Yeah. And, I think it's really clear that we point out, we've mentioned two specific kind of classes of phytonutrients, one being the glycoalkaloids and another being lectins. And first of all, here I'm reading a note that you've got some great notes in front of us here, that there's zero evidence that glycoalkaloids are the root cause of inflammation. And really the same goes also for lectins. If people have a healthy gut, a healthy microbiome, and they're eating foods that naturally have glycoalkaloids like our tomatoes and our potatoes, and also have lectins, which actually all plants have lectins, but these nightshades have higher levels of lectins. But if a person with a healthy microbiome and gut environment eats these foods and eats a lot of these foods, those compounds are not going to cause inflammation in the body. They are not the underlying cause of, they're not going to lead to any gut issues or anything like that. But if a person already has a compromised, sensitive, and inflamed gut, then they could be more sensitive. They could be more sensitive to these compounds.
Or any other compound from, again, kale or broccoli or mushrooms or onions, any phytonutrient, any plant fiber or compound is capable of creating that overwhelming phenomenon to the intestinal microbiome, which again is just a sign, a symptom, a message that we've got some work to do. We've got some room to grow and improve the health and diversity of the microbiome.
Yeah.
So why do some people, because I've heard it before, and maybe you have too, Dr. Susanna, people are told, okay, be careful, nightshades, and then they remove the nightshades. And by the way, white potatoes, nightshades, sweet potatoes, not nightshades. So people are said, exchange your white potatoes, your russet potatoes, your Yukon Golds for some yams, and you'll do better. So why would maybe some people experience benefits from that kind of short-term elimination of nightshade vegetables and fruits?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, in that kind of scenario, the benefit is to kind of take away any kind of aggravating factors in the gut lining. If the gut lining is really, really sensitive and inflamed, then it's true, we would want to be gentle to the gut lining and take away, even consider doing a short period of time of having some maybe less fibrous foods, or maybe you cook your foods a little more thoroughly so that it's easier to digest those fibers.
Or blend them up.
Exactly. But it's important to really realize that the goal is not to stay on that kind of a diet forever to manage symptoms. The goal is to really reverse the gut inflammation.
Yeah, exactly.
And how do we do that?
And we've brought up similar sort of graphics before, and here's another one looking at the intestinal gut lining of the small intestines and the large intestine or colon. And you see, and I like this one. There's so many graphics like this out there. And for those of you just listening, what we see is the intestinal lining. And what I think is a helpful, important to point out in this diagram is this layer here, which is a layer of mucus on top of the intestinal lining. And a lot of people think of, oh, mucus, I don't want mucus, but this is healthy mucus that's created and maintained from our intestinal microbiome that lives on top of this mucous membrane and helps to secrete and maintain this mucous membrane, which is a protective layer along this whole single cell thick intestinal lining. And if this intestinal mucus layer is maintained, then we're going to have overall more resilience. If we have more dysbiosis and a disproportionate population of bacteria in the gut, then we're not going to maintain this healthy mucus layer. And then our intestinal cells that are, again, just beneath the mucus layer are going to be more vulnerable to all sorts of things, call it, inflammatory agents, toxins, what have you. And then again, if you're familiar with the anatomy of the gastrointestinal tract, right below that single cell layer of our digestive lining is our immune system. So again, these nightshade compounds, these lectins, these other plant proteins or phytonutrients make their way through this one cell thick layer of our digestive lining. And then our immune system's there and says, hey, what are you doing here? You're supposed to be broken down and absorbed inside the digestive tract. You're not supposed to leak through this intestinal lining. And then that sort of activation of the immune system can potentially lead to the systemic kind of inflammatory immune response that some people experience, and that shows up like joint pain or brain fog or fatigue or any number of things. Yeah. But again, the little substance, the little food particles or phytonutrients or whatever it is that leaks through is not the problem. The problem is the intestinal barrier, the mucous membrane that more appropriately, the mucous membrane that maintains the integrity of the intestinal barrier, which is directly related to that strong, harmonious, resilient microbiome. So you diversify the microbiome, you feed the healthy microbiome, and you maintain that resilient gut health.
Yeah. Yeah. And I do think it's important to repeat once again that this phenomenon here, you can call it leaky gut, you can call it hyperpermeability of the intestines, whatever you want to call it, can happen with any food, not just nightshades. So nightshades are, this innocent food group that's gotten so much hate, but this phenomenon can happen with any food. And it kind of depends on the individual, what they're sensitive to, what their microbiome has a hard time digesting. So yeah, shall we talk a little bit about just how to heal that gut lining?
Yeah, well, we've kind of been beaten around the bush a little bit, but the way to heal it, again, is not to run away from the things like nightshades or lectins or high fiber foods. Whatever the quote unquote food intolerance is not something to fear. Once again, it's something to get curious about. It's something to approach mindfully. And maybe some people do benefit from giving themselves, again, a few days, a few weeks, a few months of a break from that food. But then when we reintroduce that food, we should do so, of course, eating organic. We should avoid the pesticides and herbicides that might be the culprit at the root cause of that digestive lining insult. But also, we should be mindful of how we're consuming that food. In other words, be grounded, be in a parasympathetic rest and digest state so that our digestive system can be activated so that we can break down these food substances and give our digestive system the best shot at absorbing appropriately and feeding the microbiome appropriately. So quality of nutrition, quality of mindset and physiology, and then of course introducing slowly. If you've got a sensitivity to potatoes or peppers or again, broccoli or garbanzo beans, whatever it is, then incorporate that on the side, just like by the spoonful, just a spoonful of potatoes, a spoonful of beans, rather than, oh, I'm going to have a big mashed potato dinner, So these are maybe three things to really consider. Again, the quality of the produce, organic, non-GMO, no pesticides, herbicides, etc., and preparing it properly. And then the quality of your physiologic state at the time of eating, and then going slowly.
Yeah. And so what this is going to do as you start reintroducing the fibers that you were kind of depriving your microbiome of, once you start to bring in more different types of plants into your diet slowly, what you're doing is you're feeding the microbes, you're feeding the beneficial microbes so that they can then further secrete those healing compounds like the short chain fatty acids that do feed that intestinal lining and create that nice, you're calling it the mucous membrane, also known as the biofilm that protects our intestinal lining. And so really the goal is to diversify our microbiome, to bring more balance in our gut microbes so that they serve us more. They act as these protective good guys that live within us. And, what's also important to recognize is that these microbes, when we have more diversity of these microbes, they are able to digest not only the fibers, but some of those specific phytonutrients like the lectins, like the glycoalkaloids. So it actually helps us to further break down our food so that we're really absorbing what we need and breaking down what we don't need.
And that's a great kind of place to wrap up on exactly where we started, essentially, that these foods, these compounds, these phytonutrients are not unhealthy, are not scary. They are, in fact, the complete opposite. They're totally healing and immune stimulating. And in many cases, they've been studied and shown to be anti-carcinogenic. They're anti-cancer. So when we are able to break down these compounds, when our microbiome is working with us and when we're in harmony and in sync with that digestive system, and we're, getting all the fuel that we need, and we're fueling our microbiome, then the byproduct, the side effect is all of these phytonutrients, all these healing compounds actually have immune stimulating, anti-cancer, vitality and longevity promoting benefits that are real. So we actually want to eat more lectins. We actually want to eat more, not the toxic nightshades, not the green potatoes and the belladonna, but we want to eat more of those glycoalkaloid containing nightshade vegetables. And there's a lot of studies and evidence that show, the more beans, the more tomatoes, the more potatoes, the more of whole, intact, real fruits and vegetables that people consume, regardless of what class they live in, whether they're the Solanaceae family or the allium family or whatever it is. The more diversity of whole plant foods, the longer people live, the less they die, and the healthier their lifespans are.
Yeah, and I actually just want to highlight a few of the other benefits that these nightshade veggies contain, because they all kind of shine in their unique ways. For example, bell peppers are one of the most vitamin C rich foods that we can eat.
I know. And then tomatoes, lycopene in tomatoes is like, it's kind of in a league of its own in terms of the lycopene content that tomatoes have, and a great carotenoid that great for the vascular system.
Great for your eyes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, potatoes, when we talk about potatoes, they are seriously a staple in the whole food plant-based lifestyle. I can't consider eating whole food plant-based without considering potatoes.
And they have like allowed for so many civilizations to survive over the course of generations. So these foods that we have kind of in a kind of short-term fad, sort of trendy way, started to be afraid of due to some misinformation, I would say, in the scientific, I wouldn't even call it the scientific community, because there's not any misinformation there, but there is some misinformation in some nutritional circles. So, take everything through a critical eye, including this information, right? And if you've got any questions, feel free to reach out. We'll be happy to point you in the direction of further science to support you in gaining peace and understanding of eating more diversity of whole plant foods. But that's the answer for health and longevity.
Yes.
So thanks for tuning in. As always, thanks for spending your Medicinal Monday with us, or whatever day of the week it is for you. And just a reminder about that announcement that we started our conversation off with. Alter Health is now on Locals. And if you'd like to join our Locals community over there, you can head over to alterhealth.locals.com, a place where we'll be sharing more content. And we also have a weekly meal guide that we put out to supporters who are looking for a little bit more support, and also that support of what we're doing over here at Alter Health. You can do so for just $11 a month.
Yeah, but even so, just heading over to Locals, we have Locals only recipes just for people who join Locals for free. You don't need to pay for those ones. So that's a little incentive to get you over to our awesome Locals community.
I know change is weird, and it is for us as well, but we're also excited about it. So thanks again for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you